What if I told you that a single cup of coffee could change two lives forever? What if a moment of hesitation meant the difference between a child going home safely or disappearing into a nightmare she might never escape? This isn't just another story about being in the right place at the right time. This is about those split-second decisions that reveal who we really are when everything is on the line. It's about a decorated Marine who thought his days of saving lives were behind him, only to discover that sometimes the most important battles happen in the most ordinary places. You're driving alone on a quiet highway, exhausted from a long journey, when you spot a rest stop ahead. All you want is a quick coffee and maybe a moment to stretch your legs. You walk inside, order your drink, and notice something that makes your blood run cold. A child sits across from a man, and something about the scene screams danger. But here's the question that will haunt you. Do you trust your instincts and risk everything? Or do you convince yourself you're imagining things and walk away? For Michael Winston, that moment of choice was about to arrive, and neither he nor the little girl in the red dress had any idea how dramatically their lives were about to change. The late afternoon sun painted the Nebraska highway in shades of gold and amber, creating long shadows that stretched across the endless fields of corn and wheat. 4 miles. There was nothing but rolling farmland broken only by the occasional farmhouse or grain silo standing sentinel against the vast sky. It was the kind of landscape that could lull a driver into a meditative trance, the rhythm of the road becoming almost hypnotic. Michael Winston had been driving for 7 hours straight, his hands gripping the steering wheel with the same focused intensity he'd once used to navigate armored vehicles through hostile territory. The transition from military life to civilian existence hadn't been as smooth as he'd hoped, and this cross-country drive was supposed to be therapeutic, a chance to clear his head and figure out what came next. At 32, Michael carried himself with the bearing of a man who'd seen things most people only glimpsed in nightmares. His military service had taken him to 3 different combat zones, where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. He'd saved lives, lost friends, and carried home memories that visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. The structured world of the Marines had given his life purpose and meaning. But now, 6 months after his honorable discharge, he found himself adrift in a civilian world that seemed both familiar and foreign. The Ember Field rest stop appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its weathered sign promising food, fuel, and respite from the endless miles of highway. Michael felt his shoulders relax slightly as he pulled into the parking lot. The building looked like it had been standing there since the 1970s, its brick facade faded but sturdy, surrounded by a handful of cars and 2 massive 18-wheelers parked at the far end of the lot. As he stepped out of his car, Michael took a deep breath of the prairie air, letting the silence wash over him. After months in crowded cities and busy airports, the quietude of rural Nebraska felt like a balm to his soul. He stretched his back, feeling the familiar ache from old injuries, and made his way toward the glass doors of the rest stop. The interior hit him with a wave of nostalgia. It was like stepping into a time capsule, complete with faded linoleum floors, wood-paneled walls, and the kind of fluorescent lighting that gave everything a slightly yellow tint. A small diner occupied the left side of the building, its red vinyl booths and chrome fixtures perfectly preserved from another era. To the right, a modest convenience store offered the usual array of snacks, beverages, and travel necessities. The dinner was quiet, occupied by perhaps a dozen people scattered across its booths and counter seats. Michael's trained eye automatically cataloged the scene: 2 long-haul truckers sharing war stories over coffee and pie, an elderly couple studying a road atlas with the intensity of military strategists, a businessman in a wrinkled suit stabbing at his phone with obvious frustration, and a middle-aged woman reading a paperback novel while methodically working through a slice of apple pie. But it was the yellow booth by the far window that caught and held his attention. A little girl, no more than 8 years old, sat rigidly in the booth, her small hands folded in her lap with unnatural stillness. She wore a bright red dress that should have made her look cheerful and vibrant, but instead seemed to emphasize her obvious discomfort. Her dark skin had an ashen quality that spoke of fear or illness, and her curly hair framed a face that was far too serious for someone her age. Across from her sat a man who appeared to be in his early 50s. His salt and pepper hair was meticulously groomed, and his navy blue business suit looked expensive and well-tailored. He held a newspaper up between himself and the girl, creating a barrier that seemed both literal and symbolic. But what unsettled Michael wasn't what the man was doing. It was what he wasn't doing. There was no warmth in his posture, no protective instinct that Michael would expect to see from a father or guardian. Instead, the man's body language spoke of control and surveillance. His eyes would periodically peer over the top of his newspaper, fixing on the girl with an intensity that made Michael's skin crawl. It wasn't the loving gaze of a parent checking on their child. It was the calculating stare of someone monitoring a possession. The girl seemed acutely aware of this scrutiny. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the table, moving only when absolutely necessary. When she did look up, it was with quick, nervous glances that never lingered on any one person or thing for too long. Everything about her posture screamed fear and submission. Michael ordered a black coffee from the tired-looking waitress, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what he was observing. He'd seen enough violence and trauma in his military service to recognize the signs of distress. But this was different. This was a child in what should have been a safe, public place. Yet every instinct he'd honed through years of combat experience was telling him that something was desperately wrong. He chose a table that gave him a clear view of the yellow booth while appearing casual and uninterested. As he sipped his coffee, Michael found himself studying the pair more intently. The age difference was stark, and while that alone wasn't necessarily suspicious, there were other details that bothered him. The man's clothes were expensive and well-maintained, while the girl's red dress, though clean, looked like something that had been hastily purchased without much thought to fit or style. More troubling was the complete absence of any interaction between them. They weren't talking, weren't sharing food, weren't engaging in any of the small rituals that typically bond adults and children during a meal. The man read his paper and drank his coffee with mechanical precision, while the girl sat in perfect stillness, as if any movement might draw unwanted attention. That's when Michael noticed something that made his blood run cold. The girl's right hand, resting on the table beside her untouched glass of milk, was positioned in what appeared to be a deliberate gesture. Her palm faced slightly upward, her fingers spread wide in a configuration that Michael recognized from his military training. It was subtle, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for, but it was unmistakably a distress signal. The Canadian hand signal for help had been developed as a silent way for people, particularly women and children, to indicate they were in danger during video calls or in situations where verbal communication might escalate a dangerous situation. The gesture involved placing the palm facing the camera or observer, tucking the thumb into the palm, and then closing the fingers over the thumb. But this girl was using a variation that was even more universal. The open palm with spread fingers that had been used by people in distress for generations. Michael's heart began to pound as he watched the girl maintain the gesture for several long seconds before slowly lowering her hand back to her lap. She glanced around the diner nervously, her eyes briefly meeting his before quickly looking away. In that fraction of a second, Michael saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: pure, desperate terror. The rational part of his mind tried to argue that he might be misinterpreting the situation. Maybe the girl was adopted. Maybe she was shy around strangers. Maybe she wasn't feeling well. There could be dozens of innocent explanations for what he was observing. But his instincts, sharpened by years of identifying threats in hostile environments, were screaming at him that this child was in immediate danger. He thought about the statistics he'd learned during his military service about human trafficking, about how predators operated, about how they moved their victims through public spaces by intimidating them into compliance. The girl's behavior, her obvious fear, the man's controlling demeanor, it all fit a pattern that made Michael's blood run cold. As he wrestled with his growing certainty that he was witnessing something terrible, the girl made the gesture again. This time, she held it longer, her eyes scanning the diner more desperately. When her gaze met Michael's again, he saw her mouth move slightly, forming what looked like the word help. That was the moment Michael's military training fully kicked in. The doubt and uncertainty evaporated, replaced by the cold, clear focus that had kept him alive through multiple deployments. This wasn't a misunderstanding or an overactive imagination. This was a child in immediate danger, and he was possibly the only person in a position to help her. But rushing in without a plan could make things worse. If the man was indeed a predator, any sudden movement might cause him to panic and flee with the girl. Michael needed to be smart about this, to use his training not just to identify the threat but to neutralize it without putting the child at greater risk. He pulled out his phone, keeping his movements casual as he pretended to check messages. Under the table, his fingers found the emergency number, but he hesitated before making the call. What if he was wrong? What if he was about to destroy an innocent man's life based on his own paranoid assumptions? The weight of the decision pressed down on him like a physical force. Then the girl made the signal a third time, and this time there was no mistaking the desperation in her gesture. Her small hand trembled as she held the position. Her eyes locked on Michael's with a pleading intensity that cut straight through his heart. Whatever doubts he'd had evaporated in that moment. This child needed help, and he was going to provide it. Michael discreetly dialed 911, his voice low and controlled as he provided the operator with their location and a careful description of what he was observing. The dispatcher, trained to handle emergency situations, asked probing questions that helped Michael articulate his concerns more clearly. When he mentioned his military background and training in threat assessment, he could hear the dispatcher's tone shift to one of greater urgency. "Officers are being dispatched to your location," the dispatcher informed him. "Can you maintain visual contact with the subjects until help arrives?" "Affirmative," Michael replied, unconsciously slipping back into military terminology. "I'll keep eyes on them." As he ended the call, Michael realized he was facing a new challenge. How could he maintain surveillance without appearing suspicious? If the man noticed he was being watched, he might decide to leave before the police arrived. Michael needed to find a way to appear casual while remaining ready to act if the situation deteriorated. He decided to approach the problem like a reconnaissance mission, moving with practiced nonchalance. He got up to refill his coffee, choosing a route that took him past the yellow booth. As he walked by, he could hear the man's voice for the first time, speaking to the girl in low, controlled tones. "Remember what we discussed," the man was saying, his words barely audible but carrying an unmistakable threat. "You know what happens if you don't behave." The girl's response was so quiet Michael almost missed it. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice carrying a weight of fear that no child should ever have to bear. The interaction confirmed Michael's worst suspicions. This wasn't a father disciplining his daughter or a guardian setting boundaries. This was a predator maintaining control over his victim through intimidation and implied threats. The military part of Michael's brain began calculating angles, exits, and potential responses while his human heart raged at the injustice of what he was witnessing. When he returned to his seat, Michael noticed that the man was now watching him more carefully. Their eyes met across the diner, and Michael saw something predatory and calculating in the man's gaze. It was the look of someone evaluating a potential threat, deciding whether immediate action was necessary. Michael forced himself to appear casual, pulling out his phone again and scrolling through it as if checking social media or reading news. But his peripheral vision remained locked on the yellow booth, tracking every movement, every gesture, every subtle shift in the dynamic between the man and the terrified child. The girl, perhaps sensing the increased tension, had gone completely still. Her hands were now firmly planted in her lap, her head down, her breathing shallow and controlled. She looked like someone trying to become invisible, to avoid drawing any attention that might escalate an already dangerous situation. Michael's experience in combat zones had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded violence. He could see those same signs now in the man's posture, the slight tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in his body position. Something was building toward a breaking point, and Michael knew he might have to act before the police arrived. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every second felt like an hour as Michael maintained his surveillance, balancing the need to monitor the situation with the equally important need to avoid escalating it through his presence. He found himself thinking about the girl's parents, wondering if they knew their daughter was missing, if they were frantically searching for her, if they had any idea how close she was to disappearing forever. Then he heard it, the distant wail of sirens. Still far away but growing closer. Relief flooded through Michael's system, followed immediately by renewed tension. This was often the most dangerous moment in any hostage situation, when the perpetrator realized their window of opportunity was closing and might make desperate, violent choices. The man in the navy suit had heard the sirens too. His head came up from his newspaper, his eyes scanning the diner with new alertness. When his gaze fell on Michael, there was a flash of recognition, a sudden understanding that his carefully constructed facade had been penetrated. "We need to go," the man said to the girl, his voice carrying a new urgency that confirmed all of Michael's suspicions. "Now." The girl looked up with obvious confusion and fear. "But you said we were going to eat lunch," she said in a small voice that carried just far enough for Michael to hear. "Plans change," the man replied curtly, standing and reaching for his jacket. "Come on." Michael knew this was the moment of truth. The police were still minutes away, and the man was preparing to leave with the girl. If he allowed them to walk out of the diner, there was a very real chance they would disappear entirely, and the girl would be lost forever. Every instinct, every piece of training, every fiber of moral conviction he possessed told him he had to act. But he also knew that confronting an armed and desperate predator in a public place could result in casualties. The diner contained innocent bystanders, including elderly patrons who could be seriously injured if violence erupted. Michael found himself facing the same kind of split-second decision that had defined his military career: how to protect the innocent while neutralizing a threat. The girl was rising from her seat now, moving with the mechanical compliance of someone who had learned that resistance brought consequences. But as she stood, her eyes met Michael's one more time, and in that look he saw not just fear, but hope. She had seen him watching, had recognized that he understood her silent pleas for help, and despite her terror, there was a tiny spark of belief that maybe, just maybe, someone was finally going to help her. That look decided it for Michael. He couldn't let this child walk out of the diner and into whatever nightmare awaited her. Military training, civilian consequences, personal risk. None of it mattered compared to the life of an innocent child who had exhausted every other option and was now depending on a stranger to save her. As the man guided the girl toward the exit, Michael rose from his seat and stepped into their path. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that had been forged in combat zones and tempered by years of command responsibility. "Is everything all right here?" The man's face went through a series of rapid changes. Surprise, calculation, forced calm. "Everything's fine," he replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "We're just leaving." Michael's gaze dropped to the girl, who was standing perfectly still, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "I was asking her," he said quietly, his tone making it clear that this wasn't a casual inquiry. The tension in the diner had shifted palpably. Other patrons were beginning to notice the confrontation, and Michael could see the man calculating his options, weighing the risks of making a scene against the dangers of being delayed any longer. "Look, friend," the man said, his tone still attempting warmth but with an underlying current of threat. "I appreciate your concern, but we really need to go. Family emergency." Michael didn't move from his position blocking their path. Behind him, he could hear the sirens getting closer, and he could see the man's growing awareness that time was running out. The girl stood between them like a small statue, too frightened to move or speak but clearly desperate for rescue. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Michael asked the girl directly, ignoring the man's increasingly agitated attempts to end the conversation. For a moment, the girl's mouth opened as if she were going to answer, but then her eyes flicked to the man and she closed it again, her head dropping in defeat. The gesture broke Michael's heart while simultaneously confirming everything he'd suspected about their relationship. "Her name's not important," the man said, his facade of friendliness finally cracking. "And neither is yours. Now step aside." Michael had faced down enemy combatants, had stared into the face of people who wanted to kill him, and he recognized the same dangerous energy radiating from the man now. but he also knew that backing down meant condemning an innocent child to unspeakable horrors. "I don't think so," Michael replied calmly. "I think we're all going to wait right here until some friends of mine arrive to sort this out." The sirens were getting closer now, close enough that everyone in the diner could hear them clearly. The man's eyes darted toward the windows, then back to Michael, his calculations becoming more desperate by the second. "You're making a mistake," the man said, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." Michael stepped closer, his own voice dropping to match the man's tone. "I know exactly what I'm interfering with," he replied. "The question is, are you going to make this easy or hard?" The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Two men locked in a battle of wills with a child's life hanging in the balance. Michael could see the man weighing his options, calculating whether he could overpower or somehow bypass the obstacle that stood between him and escape. Then the first police car pulled into the parking lot, its lights painting the interior of the diner in alternating flashes of red and blue. The man's shoulders sagged slightly as he realized his window of opportunity had closed. "This isn't over," he muttered, but the fight had gone out of him. He knew, as Michael knew, that the game had changed irrevocably. Officer Sarah Martinez was the first through the door, her hand resting on her service weapon as she quickly assessed the scene. Behind her came Officer James Wright, a veteran with 20 years of experience who had responded to more domestic disputes and child endangerment calls than he cared to remember. Michael raised his hand slowly, showing he wasn't a threat. "I'm the one who called," he said clearly. "This man was attempting to leave with the child, and I believe she's in immediate danger." The officers moved with practiced efficiency, separating Michael and the man while keeping the girl in clear sight. Officer Martinez knelt down to the child's eye level, her voice gentle but authoritative. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said. "My name is Sarah, and I'm a police officer. Can you tell me your name?" For the first time since Michael had been observing her, the girl spoke clearly and loudly enough for everyone to hear. "My name is Zoe," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "And I want to go home to my daddy." The words hit the diner like a thunderbolt. The man, who had been attempting to maintain his composure, went pale as his carefully constructed story began to crumble. Michael felt a surge of relief and vindication, knowing that his instincts had been correct and his actions justified. Officer Wright approached the man with professional caution. "Sir, I need to see some identification, and I need you to explain your relationship to this child." The man fumbled for his wallet, his hands shaking slightly as he handed over his driver's license. "Gregory Mason," he said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. She's my stepdaughter. We were just having lunch." But Zoe was shaking her head vigorously. "No," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet diner. "He's not my daddy. He took me from school. I want my real daddy." The words exploded like a bomb in the confined space. Other patrons gasped. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and all eyes turned to the unfolding drama. Gregory Mason's face went from pale to ashen as his lies unraveled in real time. Officer Martinez continued to speak soothingly to Zoe, gradually coaxing more information from the frightened child. As the story emerged, piece by piece, the full horror of the situation became clear. Gregory Mason was indeed Zoe's stepfather, married to her biological mother, but Zoe's parents were divorced, and her biological father had been awarded full custody after a bitter legal battle that had raised serious questions about the mother's fitness as a parent. The custody arrangement had been a source of ongoing conflict, with Zoe's mother and her new husband repeatedly attempting to challenge the court's decision. When legal avenues failed, they had apparently decided to take matters into their own hands. Gregory Mason had picked Zoe up from her after-school program, telling the staff he was there on behalf of her mother for a dentist appointment. The school, not aware of the specific custody restrictions, had allowed him to take her. By the time Zoe's real father had arrived for his regular pickup, she was long gone. As Officer Wright placed Gregory Mason under arrest, reading him his rights in the ritual words that would begin his journey through the justice system, Michael felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that Zoe was safe, anger at the adults who had put her through this trauma, and a deep sadness for a little girl who had been used as a pawn in her parents' bitter conflicts. But there was also something else, a sense of purpose and validation that had been missing from his life since leaving the military. For the first time in months, Michael felt like he had made a difference, like his training and instincts had been used for something meaningful and important. The reunion between Zoe and her biological father, David Chin, took place at the police station 2 hours later. David worked as a software engineer in Omaha and had been frantically searching for his daughter since discovering she was missing. The school had called him when they realized their mistake, and he had immediately contacted the police and begun driving the route he thought Gregory might have taken. When Zoe saw her father walk into the police station, her composure finally cracked. She ran to him with a sob that seemed to come from the depths of her soul, throwing her arms around him and clinging to him as if she would never let go. David dropped to his knees, gathering his daughter into his arms, tears streaming down his face as he whispered reassurances and apologies. "I'm so sorry, baby," he kept repeating. "Daddy's here now. You're safe. You're safe." Michael watched the reunion from across the room, feeling his own eyes well up with tears he hadn't shed since his last deployment. This was why he had served, why he had risked his life in distant countries, why he had dedicated years of his life to protecting others. It wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about moments like this, when love triumphed over evil and innocence was preserved. Officer Martinez approached Michael with a warm smile. "You know," she said, "in 15 years of police work, I've seen a lot of people look the other way when something didn't feel right. Thank you for not being one of them." Michael nodded, his throat too tight for easy speech. "I couldn't have lived with myself if I'd done nothing," he finally managed. "Most people convince themselves they're imagining things," Officer Wright added, joining the conversation. "Your military training probably helped you recognize the signs, but it was your moral courage that made the difference. That little girl is going home tonight because you decided to trust your instincts and get involved." As the evening wore on and statements were taken, the full scope of Gregory and his wife's plan became clear. They had intended to drive Zoe to Mexico, where they had made arrangements to live under false identities while they fought the custody decision from abroad. It was a plan that would have effectively kidnapped Zoe from her biological father permanently, destroying both their lives in the process. The evidence against Gregory was overwhelming. His cell phone contained text messages with his wife detailing their plans, including discussions of forged documents and contact information for people who specialized in helping others disappear. There were also disturbing references to what they would do if Zoe proved difficult to manage during their journey. When David Chin learned the full details of what had almost happened to his daughter, he sought out Michael with an expression that mixed gratitude, horror, and determination. "I don't know how to thank you," David said, his voice heavy with emotion. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't acted, I might never have seen her again." Michael, uncomfortable with praise as always, tried to deflect. "Any decent person would have done the same thing," he said. David shook his head firmly. "No, they wouldn't have. Most people would have convinced themselves it was none of their business, or that they were probably wrong, or that someone else would handle it. You chose to get involved, and that choice saved my daughter's life." He paused, composing himself before continuing. "I know this might sound strange, given the circumstances, but I'd like you to come to dinner sometime. Zoe keeps asking about the nice man who helped her, and I think it would be good for her to see you again in a normal, safe environment. You've become part of her story now, part of her recovery." Michael was touched by the invitation but uncertain about inserting himself further into their lives. "I don't know if that's such a good idea," he said. "She's been through enough trauma without having reminders of what happened." "That's exactly why it's important," David replied. "Right now, you represent safety to her, someone who saw she was in trouble and chose to help. Her therapist thinks it would be beneficial for her to maintain that positive association." 3 weeks later, Michael found himself standing on the front porch of a modest house in Omaha, holding a bouquet of flowers and wondering if he was making a mistake. His concern evaporated the moment Zoe opened the door, her face lighting up with genuine joy when she saw him. "Daddy," she called over her shoulder. "The hero man is here." The description made Michael wince, but David's welcoming smile put him at ease. "She's been talking about you nonstop," David said, inviting him inside. "You've become something of a legend in this house." The dinner was a revelation for Michael. He had expected awkwardness, painful reminders of the trauma they had all shared. Instead, he found himself welcomed into a warm, loving home where Zoe had clearly thrived despite her ordeal. She chattered excitedly about school, her friends, her art projects, displaying the resilience that children possess in abundance when they feel safe and loved. It wasn't until after dinner, when Zoe was showing Michael her drawings, that the conversation turned to what had happened at the rest stop. "I learned about the help signal in school," Zoe explained matter-of-factly, holding up a drawing that showed a stick figure with an outstretched hand. "Our teacher taught us that if we were ever in trouble and couldn't talk, we could use our hands to ask for help." "That was very smart of you," Michael said, his voice gentle. "You were very brave." Zoe considered this seriously. "I was scared," she admitted, "but I remembered what Daddy always tells me about how there are good people in the world who help others. I hoped you were one of the good people." The simple statement hit Michael with unexpected force. After months of questioning his purpose and place in the world, an 8-year-old girl had articulated something profound about human nature and moral responsibility. There were indeed good people in the world, and sometimes being one of them required nothing more than paying attention and choosing to act. As the evening wound down and Michael prepared to leave, David walked him to his car. "You know," David said, "Zoe's therapist suggested something interesting. She said that positive experiences after trauma can actually help healing. Having you here, seeing you as a friend rather than just someone from the worst day of her life, it's helping her process what happened in a healthier way." Michael nodded, understanding the psychology behind the suggestion. He had seen similar approaches used with combat veterans, helping them reframe traumatic experiences by connecting them to positive outcomes and relationships. "I'd like to stay in touch," David continued, "not just for Zoe's sake, but for mine too. You gave me back my daughter, Michael. You preserved my family. That creates a bond that I hope we can honor." 6 months later, Michael found himself at Zoe's 9th birthday party, surrounded by a dozen children and their parents in David's backyard. He watched Zoe blow out her candles and make her wish, her face glowing with happiness and security. As she opened her presents, she insisted that Michael sit beside her, proudly introducing him to her friends as "my hero who saved me." The designation still made Michael uncomfortable, but he had learned to accept it gracefully. More importantly, he had found something he didn't even know he was looking for: a sense of family, of belonging, of purpose that extended beyond his military service. As the party wound down and parents began collecting their children, Zoe approached Michael with a carefully wrapped package. "This is for you," she said solemnly. "I made it myself." Inside the wrapping was a hand-drawn picture showing 2 figures standing in what was clearly meant to be the rest stop diner. One figure was tall with dark hair, the other small with curly hair and a red dress. Between them, barely visible unless you looked closely, was a small heart drawn in red crayon. "It's us," Zoe explained unnecessarily. "The day you saved me." Michael studied the drawing, noting the care Zoe had taken with the details. The rest stop was recognizable, complete with yellow booths and vending machines. But what struck him most was how she had drawn the 2 figures, not as victim and rescuer, but as 2 people connected by something larger than themselves. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll treasure this." "Good," Zoe replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom of childhood, "because that's when you became part of our family." That night, as Michael hung Zoe's drawing on his refrigerator, he reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. 6 months ago, he had been a directionless veteran struggling to find meaning in civilian life. A chance stop for coffee had led to a confrontation that had not only saved a child's life but had given his own life new purpose and direction. He had learned something important about heroism in the process. It wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments of courage, though those certainly had their place. Real heroism was often much quieter and more accessible. It was about paying attention, trusting your instincts, and choosing to act when action was needed. It was about caring enough about strangers to risk embarrassment, inconvenience, or even danger on their behalf. Most importantly, Michael had learned that the transition from military to civilian life didn't have to mean abandoning his sense of mission and service. The skills he had learned in the Marines, the instincts he had developed, the moral framework that had guided him through combat, all of these were just as valuable in civilian life. The battles were different, but the underlying principles remained the same: protect the innocent, stand up for those who cannot defend themselves, and never walk away when someone needs help. As he prepared for bed that night, Michael's phone buzzed with a text message from David. "Zoe wants me to tell you that she's going to teach all her friends the help signal, so they can be safe too. You've started something bigger than you know." Michael smiled as he read the message. Perhaps that was the most important lesson of all. That one act of courage, one decision to get involved, could ripple outward in ways you never anticipated. Zoe would grow up knowing that there were people in the world who would help her if she needed it. She would pass that knowledge on to others, and somewhere down the line, another child in danger might be saved because Zoe had learned the importance of paying attention and speaking up. The last thing Michael thought about as he drifted off to sleep was the moment when Zoe had first made the distress signal in the rest stop. He had been facing a choice that millions of people face every day, the choice between involvement and indifference, between risking embarrassment and ensuring safety, between the easy path of assumption and the harder path of action. He was grateful that his training, his instincts, and ultimately his conscience had led him to make the right choice. Not just for Zoe, and not just for David, but for himself, because in saving a child he had never met before, Michael had also found his own path forward into a life of purpose and meaning. The rest stop where it all began still stood on that lonely stretch of Nebraska highway, still serving coffee and comfort to travelers making their way across the endless prairie. But for Michael Winston, it would always be more than just a place to grab a quick break. It was the place where a random moment of observation had led to a lifetime of connection, where military training had met civilian responsibility, and where the simple act of trusting his instincts had changed two lives forever. Sometimes, Michael reflected, the most important battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the quiet moments of everyday life, when we choose to see what others miss and act when action is needed. The uniform might change, the location might shift, but the core mission remains the same: to protect and serve, to stand watch for those who cannot stand watch for themselves, and to never forget that heroism is not about being fearless, but about acting despite our fears because someone else needs us to. And on a cold winter morning 6 months later, when Michael received a wedding invitation from David Chen and his new fiancée, with a note saying that Zoe had specifically requested that he walk her down the aisle as her honorary uncle, Michael knew that his decision in that Nebraska rest stop had created something far more valuable than he had ever imagined. The wedding took place on a bright Saturday morning in spring, with Zoe resplendent in a pale pink dress that made her look like a princess. She had insisted on having a special role in the ceremony, and as Michael watched her carefully carry the rings down the aisle, he marveled at how far she had come from the terrified child he had first encountered. David's fiancée, Sarah, was a pediatric nurse who had entered their lives through Zoe's therapy sessions. She understood trauma, understood healing, and had embraced both David and Zoe with a warmth that had helped complete their family's recovery. When she had learned about Michael's role in their story, she had welcomed him with the same open heart she had shown to Zoe. "You know," Sarah told Michael during the reception, "Zoe talks about you as the person who taught her that adults can be trusted to help. That's not a small thing for a child who went through what she did." As the celebration continued around them, Michael found himself thinking about the ripple effects of that single decision in the rest stop. Zoe was thriving in school, had made friends, and was learning to trust again. David had found love and happiness with Sarah, Even Gregory Mason, serving his sentence for attempted kidnapping, was receiving counseling that might help him confront the toxic patterns that had led to his crimes. But perhaps most significantly, Zoe had indeed begun teaching other children about safety signals and the importance of speaking up when something felt wrong. She had become a small ambassador for awareness, sharing her story age-appropriately with classmates and friends. Her teacher had invited her to participate in a safety program for the entire school district. The thing is, Zoe explained to Michael as they danced together at the reception, her small feet standing on his shoes as he guided her around the dance floor. I used to think that bad things just happened and there was nothing you could do. But then you showed me that there are always people watching out for us. We just have to know how to let them know we need help. The wisdom in her words struck Michael deeply. At 9 years old, Zoe had articulated something profound about community, about the interconnectedness of human experience, about the responsibility we all share for each other's welfare. Over the following years, Michael watched Zoe grow from a traumatized child into a confident young woman. She excelled in school, developed a passion for art therapy, and never lost her belief in the fundamental goodness of people. When she turned 16, she started volunteering with organizations that helped other children who had experienced trauma, bringing her unique perspective and hard-won wisdom to kids who needed to hear that survival was possible, that healing was real, and that there were people in the world who would fight for them. I want to be like you were for me, she told Michael on her 18th birthday. I want to be the person who pays attention, who acts when action is needed. Michael, now working as a counselor for veterans transitioning to civilian life, had found his own path forward by helping others navigate the challenges he had faced. His experience with Zoe had taught him that the skills and instincts developed in military service could be channeled into civilian protection and care in countless ways. You already are that person, he told her. You've been that person since you were 8 years old and brave enough to ask for help. The rest is just building on that foundation. As Zoe prepared to leave for college, where she planned to study social work and trauma counseling, she gave Michael a gift that took his breath away. It was a framed photograph of the old Nebraska rest stop, which she had visited with David as part of her healing journey the previous summer. On the back, she had written, "For Uncle Mike, who taught me that heroes aren't people who aren't afraid, they're people who act despite their fear because someone else needs them to. Thank you for seeing me, for believing me, and for showing me that love is stronger than evil." This is where our story began, but it will never end. Looking at the photograph, Michael could see that the rest stop had been renovated since that fateful day. Fresh paint, new signage, modernized facilities. But for him, it would always be frozen in time at that moment when he had to choose between safety and service, between assumption and action, between walking away and stepping up. Now, years later, as Michael prepared to give a speech at a conference for child safety advocates, he reflected on what that moment had taught him about courage, about community, and about the unexpected ways our lives can intersect and transform each other. He had learned that heroism wasn't about seeking out dramatic moments of rescue. It was about being present, being aware, and being willing to trust the instincts that tell us when something is wrong. It was about understanding that our obligation to each other doesn't end at the boundaries of our own families or communities, but extends to every vulnerable person who crosses our path. Most importantly, Michael had learned that the end of military service didn't have to mean the end of a life dedicated to protection and service. The battlefield might change, the uniform might be different, but the core mission remained constant: to stand watch, to stay alert, and to act when action was needed. As he took the stage to address an audience of social workers, law enforcement officers, teachers, and child advocates, Michael began with the words that had become his signature opening. What if I told you that a single cup of coffee could change 2 lives forever? What if a moment of awareness could mean the difference between a child going home safely or disappearing into a nightmare they might never escape? He paused, looking out at the faces in the audience, seeing in them the same mixture of dedication and determination that had driven him to act all those years ago. This isn't just a story about being in the right place at the right time. This is about understanding that we are all in the right place at the right time, every day. to make a difference in someone's life. The question isn't whether opportunities to help will present themselves. The question is whether we'll be paying enough attention to recognize them, and whether we'll have the courage to act when we do. In the audience, Zoe Chen sat in the front row, now a college graduate working as a victim advocate. Next to her sat her father David and stepmother Sarah, their own children, Michael's honorary nieces and nephews, listening intently to the story they had heard many times but never tired of hearing. As Michael told the story of that day in Nebraska, he emphasized the lessons that had taken years to fully understand, that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary courage when they choose to pay attention, that the skills we develop in one phase of life can serve us in unexpected ways in the next, and that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply trust our instincts and refuse to look the other way when someone needs help. The truth is, Michael concluded, we all have the capacity to be the person someone else needs in their darkest moment. We all have the ability to recognize distress signals, to trust our instincts when something feels wrong, and to take action even when we're not certain we're right. The only thing standing between us and making a life-changing difference is our willingness to get involved. After his speech, as audience members approached to share their own stories of intervention and rescue, Michael was reminded once again of the profound truth Zoe had taught him, that love really is stronger than evil, that communities of care can be built one conscious choice at a time, and that the simple act of paying attention to each other can create ripples of protection and healing that extend far beyond what we can imagine. The Nebraska rest stop still stands today, serving coffee and comfort to travelers crossing the endless prairie. And somewhere, perhaps at this very moment, someone is making the choice between involvement and indifference, between assumption and action, between the easy path of looking away and the harder path of stepping up. The story continues, written by countless individuals who choose to trust their instincts, who refuse to convince themselves they're imagining things, and who understand that heroism is not about being fearless, it's about acting despite our fears because someone else needs us to. Because sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with weapons and strategies, but with awareness and courage, in the quiet moments when we choose to see what others miss and act when action is needed. And in those moments, lives are saved, families are preserved, and the faith that there are good people in the world is renewed once again.